There are things that happen inside those walls that never make the papers. Not because journalists don't care. Not because the palace manages to bury everything, though God knows they try. It's because sometimes, the people who actually see something are so caught off guard, so unprepared for what they've witnessed, that they spend days convincing themselves it wasn't real. That they imagined it. That royal families couldn't possibly be this human, this messy, this raw. I wasn't supposed to be there that day. That's the honest truth of it. I was a staff coordinator, a junior one, barely 8 months into the role, and I had been asked to cover a colleague's shift at the last minute. A private garden event. Light duties. Nothing that required any particular skill or experience. Just show up, be invisible, make sure the water jug stayed full and the linen stayed straight. Simple enough. Except nothing about that afternoon turned out to be simple. Not even close. It was a Tuesday in early October. One of those days where autumn hasn't quite committed yet. The morning had been bright, almost warm, but by early afternoon a gray lid had settled over the sky and the air had that particular bite to it that makes the back of your neck prickle. The garden had been set up beautifully, the way they always are for these smaller private occasions. Round tables with cream linen. Low floral arrangements, nothing too tall, nothing that blocked sightlines. Tea service, obviously. Finger sandwiches that nobody ever really eats. The whole aesthetic of controlled elegance that the palace does so effortlessly it almost makes you forget it costs a fortune to maintain. There were maybe 30 people in attendance. A private gathering, not a state occasion, not a charity function for cameras. The kind of event that gets described vaguely in internal memos as a family-adjacent social afternoon. Which, in palace language, means it's personal. It's small. And, you, as staff, are absolutely not supposed to notice anything. I noticed everything. Charlotte arrived with 2 of her protection officers and a woman I recognized as one of her personal assistants, a quietly efficient woman in her 30s who had the posture of someone trained to anticipate problems before they happened. Charlotte herself was in a dark green dress, her hair pulled back, and she looked, I don't know how else to say this, she looked like someone who had already had a long day and the main event hadn't even started yet. There was something in her jaw. A kind of set. Like she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. I'd seen her at events before, briefly. She always presents beautifully. Warm smile, the right words, the kind of composed energy that reads as effortless from a distance. But, up close, and I was close that day, closer than most staff get, you notice the seams. The slight pause before she engages. The way her eyes move around a room the moment she enters, cataloging everything and everyone before she's committed to a single interaction. She was scanning the garden when she walked in. And there was a specific moment, just a flicker, barely 2 seconds, where something shifted in her expression. I was too far away to understand why. I followed her eye line but couldn't pinpoint what had caught her attention. A cluster of guests near the far hedge. Men in conversation. 2 or 3 of them, laughing at something. I thought nothing of it. I went back to my duties. The first hour passed the way these things usually do. Polite conversation drifting across the lawn like smoke. The clinking of teacups. Someone laughing a little too loudly near the roses and, then, immediately modulating down, remembering where they were. I moved between the tables, refilling, straightening, staying at the periphery the way you're trained to do. Charlotte moved through the gathering with practiced grace. She spoke to this person, then, that one. She laughed at something a woman in blue said to her. She accepted a cup of tea and held it without ever really drinking from it. I noticed that. She just carried it, which I've since learned is a thing people do at events when they want to look occupied but need their hands free to gesture, to pivot, to excuse themselves gracefully. But she kept coming back to a certain part of the garden. Not obviously. Not in a way that would read as strange to anyone just glancing over. But I was watching the whole space, that's my job, and I started to notice that her orbit kept pulling her back toward the southern end of the lawn, near the low stone wall with the climbing hydrangea. And every time she drifted that direction, she would slow down. Just slightly. Then, redirect. Like she was being drawn towards something she was also trying to avoid. I still didn't understand what. Then, Tom Bowles walked over to her. I need to explain something about Tom Bowles before I say anything else, because otherwise what follows won't make sense. Camilla's son from her first marriage had a reputation among staff, among the kind of people who work these events regularly, for being difficult in a very specific way. Not obviously difficult. Not the kind of difficult that anyone would ever be able to point to and name. It was a subtler thing. A way of entering rooms and immediately establishing that he owned the social temperature of the space. A way of speaking to people, women especially, but not exclusively, that always contained a current underneath the words. A little too familiar. A little too confident. Never quite crossing a line that could be called out, but always grazing it. People who'd worked palace-adjacent events for years had stories. Small ones, the kind that when you told them individually sounded like you were being oversensitive. But they accumulated. They added up. There was a colleague of mine who'd worked a private dinner 18 months earlier who described an exchange with him that made her uncomfortable enough that she'd asked not to be assigned to events where he was likely to attend. Her supervisor had nodded, made a note, and moved on. No formal complaint. No record of it. Just a quiet understanding between women who worked in certain spaces that some men required a wider berth. I didn't know all of this at the time. I pieced it together later. In the moment, I just registered his presence the way you register any guest who carries a particular kind of energy, aware, alert, keeping a little more mental space available. He walked over to Charlotte and I watched from maybe 15 feet away. The greeting was fine. Normal. He smiled, she smiled. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear. Then, he leaned in, too close, the lean was too close, and said something that made her go very still. It wasn't dramatic. That's what I keep coming back to. It wasn't a scene. There was no raised voice, no visible confrontation. From across the lawn it would have looked like two people having a perfectly ordinary conversation. But I was 15 feet away. And I watched her face. That particular expression, I've only seen it a handful of times in my life, and each time it's been on a woman who has just had something said to her that she cannot respond to in public. Something that requires an enormous amount of energy to not react to. Something that sits under the skin like a splinter. Her chin lifted very slightly. Her smile stayed in place. She said something brief in response, one sentence, maybe two. He laughed. She didn't. And then, he moved on, as casually as if he'd just commented on the weather, leaving her standing there with her untouched teacup and that terrible stillness she'd been trying so hard to hold together all afternoon. She held it for about 30 more seconds. Then, she turned toward the far end of the garden, away from the guests, away from the tables, and she walked with measured, quiet steps toward the door in the stone wall that led through to the inner courtyard. I was the only one who followed with my eyes. I don't know what made me do what I did next. Instinct, maybe. Or just the particular instinct that women who work in close proximity to other women in distress develop over time, a kind of fine-tuned antenna for when someone needs a moment and doesn't know how to ask for it. I picked up a small tray with a fresh pot of tea and 2 clean cups and I followed her through the door. The inner courtyard was quiet. Shaded. The sounds of the garden event became muffled almost immediately. You could still hear the low murmur of conversation, the occasional clink, but it was like turning down a dial. She was standing with her back to me, both hands resting on the edge of a stone ledge, her head bowed. Her shoulders were moving. I stopped. She heard me anyway. She turned, and I want to be honest about what I saw because I think it matters. Her eyes were full. Not streaming, not out of control, but full. The kind of full that takes considerable effort to maintain. And there was something else in her face, underneath the composure she was still desperately trying to maintain. Something that looked very much like exhaustion. Not tiredness. Exhaustion. The bone-deep kind that comes from performing calm in situations where you have absolutely no right to fall apart. She looked at the tray in my hands. I thought you might want a fresh cup, I said. The one out there's gone cold. It was such an ordinary thing to say. Deliberately ordinary. I think she recognized that. She gave me a look, brief, searching, and then she nodded. I set the tray on the ledge beside her and poured without saying anything else. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside the wall, someone laughed at something. We stood in the courtyard for maybe 3 minutes. She didn't cry. She steadied herself, visibly, breath by breath. And then she straightened. Set her shoulders. Put the cup down. Thank you, she said. Very quietly. And she went back through the door. I stood in the courtyard alone for a moment, looking at the half-drunk cup of tea, and I thought about all the things that had just happened that nobody would ever see. That nobody would write about. That would evaporate into the gray October afternoon like they'd never occurred. William had been inside the main building during all of this. He hadn't seen any of it. He had no idea. The thing about palace events is that they run on a very particular kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, there's almost never actual quiet. There's always noise, footsteps on gravel, low conversation, the creak of a door being opened by someone whose job it is to open doors. But, underneath all of that is a different kind of silence. An enforced one. The silence of everyone in the space making a collective agreement not to say certain things. Not to notice certain things. Not to remember certain things once they've left the grounds. It's a practiced skill. You develop it quickly or you don't last. I developed it. Mostly. But, what happened in the following hour tested every bit of discipline I had, because what I witnessed through the rest of that afternoon wasn't a single moment, it was a slow accumulation. A drip 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 of small wrongnesses that together formed something much larger and much more troubling. Let me try to explain what I mean. I went back through the door after Charlotte. I gave it a minute, enough that it wouldn't look like I'd been following her, and then I slipped back to my position near the tea station. She had re-entered the gathering and resumed her circuit of the tables. From a distance she looked entirely normal. Composed. Present. But she didn't venture to the southern end of the lawn again. And I noticed that her protection officer, the senior one, a broad man in his late 40s with a quality of stillness about him that I'd always associated with people who had seen genuinely dangerous situations, had repositioned himself. He'd been standing nearer the garden entrance when the event started. Now he was closer to the middle of the space, and his positioning was subtly, unmistakably oriented toward Tom Bowles. Not obviously. Not in a way that would read as significant to most people. But I'd been watching that particular officer work at 2 or 3 events before and I knew where he normally stood. He'd moved. Deliberately. Tom Bowles, for his part, seemed oblivious to this. Or perhaps he was simply untroubled by it, I couldn't determine which. He continued to move through the gathering with that easy, proprietary confidence. He was charming, genuinely. The kind of person who has learned that charm is an instrument and who plays it with considerable skill. He spoke to a woman near the rosebeds and made her laugh. He clapped a hand on the shoulder of an older man and exchanged what looked like warm words. He accepted a glass of something, champagne, I think, though it was still only mid-afternoon, and surveyed the garden with the expression of someone who feels very much at home wherever they happen to be standing. That expression. I kept coming back to it throughout the afternoon. That particular brand of ease that reads, at first glance, as warmth and social confidence, but which, if you looked at it long enough, started to reveal something else underneath. A kind of ownership. The ease of a person who has never, in his life, been in a space and felt that he didn't belong there. Who has never had to navigate the calculation of whether he was welcome. Charlotte had to make that calculation constantly. You could see it in the micro-adjustments she made as she moved. The slight quickening of step when she passed certain people. The careful choreography of where she positioned herself relative to him. And, still, she kept it together. Kept the face. Kept the warmth in her voice when she spoke to people. Kept performing the afternoon. I have enormous respect for what that takes. Enormous. It was around 3:30 when the second incident happened. I say incident, it was even smaller than the first one, visually. If you replayed the afternoon on camera, you might watch it 3 times before you caught it. But I was right there, maybe 10 feet away, when it occurred, and I can tell you that it was not small. Not in any way that mattered. Charlotte was speaking with a woman I didn't recognize, silver-haired, elegant, someone from the European diplomatic circuit by the look of her, and they seemed to be having a genuine conversation, the kind where both people are actually interested in what the other is saying. Charlotte had relaxed, fractionally. The tension in her jaw had softened. She was leaning in slightly, listening. Tom Bowles appeared at the edge of their conversation. He didn't interrupt. That would have been too obvious, too clumsy. What he did was simply establish his presence close enough that Charlotte became aware of him. You could see the moment the awareness hit her, a tiny tightening around the eyes, and then he waited until the silver-haired woman had paused for breath and said something to Charlotte. Low, casual, aimed just at her. I caught 3 words. I'm not going to write them here. Partly because I can't be completely certain of the full sentence, and I'm not interested in putting words in anyone's mouth that I didn't fully hear. But the 3 words I caught were enough. Enough for context. Enough to understand the intent behind them. What I will say is that Charlotte's response was a masterclass in containment. She smiled. Pleasantly. The kind of smile that has been trained into certain women from an early age, the smile that acknowledges but doesn't engage, that deflects without deflecting, that says I heard you and I am giving you nothing. She returned her attention smoothly to the silver-haired woman and picked up the thread of their conversation as if there had been no interruption at all. Tom Bowles watched her for a moment, that same easy confidence on his face, and then he moved on. The silver-haired woman hadn't caught any of it. She was already deep back into whatever they'd been discussing. I looked at Charlotte's hands. The teacup she was holding, she was gripping it. Not obviously, not in a way that shook or rattled. But her knuckles had whitened, just slightly. And she held that grip for a long time after Tom Bowles had drifted away. Long after her face had smoothed back into warmth and attentiveness. She held that grip until the cup was empty. Here is the thing about William that I keep coming back to. He's a good man. I believe that. From everything I've seen, from every account I've heard from people who work in proximity to the family, he is a genuinely decent person who loves his wife and takes his responsibilities seriously. I'm not trying to paint him as indifferent or negligent. But he was inside that afternoon. In a meeting in one of the inner rooms, something to do with a charitable initiative, I was told later. The kind of thing that pulls him away from these smaller social occasions because his calendar is a landscape of competing obligations and someone always has to be somewhere. He didn't know what was happening outside. And the difficult, uncomfortable truth of that is this: even if he had been in the garden, even if he'd been standing 20 feet away watching the afternoon unfold, would he have seen it? Would he have caught those glances, those lean-ins, those 3 words? Would he have noticed the whitening of her knuckles around a teacup? I don't ask this to be harsh. I ask it because it's a genuine question that stayed with me for a long time afterward. We see what we're equipped to see. We notice what our experience has trained us to notice. And men who have never had to develop the particular vigilance that women in certain spaces require, men who have never had to run the constant background calculation of where is safe and where is not, sometimes simply don't catch what's plainly visible to anyone who's ever had to run that calculation themselves. Charlotte has been running it her whole adult life. The garden saw it. Her protection officer saw it. I saw it. William did not. By 4 o'clock the gathering had begun to thin. People finishing their tea, collecting their things, being guided toward the exit with the smooth efficiency that these events always end with. Charlotte was near the entrance, saying her goodbyes warm, gracious, present, and she was doing it beautifully. Anyone looking at her would have seen a poised, composed young woman performing all the correct social functions. Tom Bowles left before she did. He didn't seek her out for a farewell, whether out of indifference or calculation, I couldn't tell. He said his goodbyes to a few people near the gate, shook a couple of hands, and then he was gone. The garden felt marginally different after he left. a texture change, subtle but real. I noticed a few of the female staff members whose posture hadn't quite been normal for the past hour physically relax in ways they probably weren't even conscious of. Charlotte remained until the last guests had departed. Afterward, there was a brief window, maybe 7 or 8 minutes, where the garden was just staff, moving through the cleanup process. And Charlotte stood near the stone ledge, the same one from the courtyard, watching us work with an expression I can only describe as the face a person makes when they've set down something very heavy and aren't quite sure yet what their body feels like without the weight of it. Her assistant approached her with something low-voiced. Charlotte nodded, slowly. Then, William came through the side door from the main building. He was in good spirits. Light energy, the kind he carries when a meeting has gone well. He crossed the garden toward her and said something that made her smile, and the smile was different from the smiles I'd been watching all afternoon. It was real. You could see the difference immediately, the way the whole face shifts when it's genuine versus performed. She reached out and, briefly, quietly, touched his arm. He said something else. She laughed. And they walked back inside together. He put his hand on her back as they went through the door. He had no idea. He genuinely had no idea what the afternoon had cost her. What she had absorbed, and steadied, and held. What she had carried through every cup of tea and every careful smile and every measured step away from the southern end of the lawn. He was just happy the meeting had gone well. He was just glad to see her. He didn't know. And, watching them disappear through that door, I felt something complicated, something that was part relief, because she was with him now and that clearly mattered to her, and part something sadder and harder to name. The particular sadness of watching someone protected by love but exposed by circumstance. Of understanding that the people who love us most are not always the people best positioned to see what we need protecting from. The garden kept its silence. The way it always does. I left that afternoon and didn't tell anyone. Not immediately. Not for a while. Part of it was the NDA, the non-disclosure agreement that everyone working palace-adjacent events signs before they set foot on the grounds. You know what you're agreeing to when you sign it. You understand that your silence is part of your role. It's not hidden from you, not sneaked past you in fine print. It's front and center. What you see, what you hear, what you experience while you are here belongs here. You do not carry it out with you in any form that might make it public. I understood that. I respected it, even. Because there are real reasons for it, good reasons, personal privacy, dignity, the basic human right to not have every moment of your life observed and narrated. But, I kept thinking about the garden. About those minutes in the courtyard. About the grip of her hands on that teacup. About the fact that nothing I had witnessed was going to be addressed. That the man responsible for that afternoon's particular quality of discomfort was going to get in a car and go home and wake up tomorrow and do whatever he always did. That life was simply going to continue, as it always does after these invisible things happen in invisible spaces. And I kept thinking about William. In the weeks that followed, I did what most people who work in those environments do. I processed it in fragments. I turned it over in my mind during the commute, while making dinner, in the 10 minutes before sleep when the brain runs its nightly audit of unresolved things. I told 2 people I trusted completely, not with specific identifying details, not in ways that violated anything material, but in the way you have to sometimes just say I saw something and have someone else confirm that what you saw was real. Both of them said the same thing, which was, what are you going to do about it? And I didn't have an answer. Because the honest truth is there wasn't much I could do. I'd seen something. I'd witnessed a pattern of behavior over the course of a few hours. I hadn't heard a full exchange. I hadn't recorded anything. I hadn't documented anything in real time. I was a junior staff coordinator who had covered a colleague's shift and who had no formal relationship with anyone involved. What I had was a memory. Very clear, very specific, very certain. And the particular heaviness that comes with that. But here's what I want to talk about in this final part, because I think it's the part that matters most, more than the specific events of that afternoon, more than the details of what was said or done. What I want to talk about is the silence around it. Not my silence specifically. The wider one. The structural one. The one that exists in places like that, in families like that, where the architecture of the whole arrangement is built around the maintenance of appearances, around the prioritization of the external narrative, around the very old and very stubborn idea that certain things are simply not spoken of. It's not unique to royal families. I want to be clear about that. This particular species of silence exists in old money, in political dynasties, in any structure where the stakes of image are high enough that the cost of naming a problem out loud always feels greater than the cost of absorbing it quietly. The women inside these structures absorb a great deal. Have always absorbed a great deal. And they do it with a grace and a composure that gets mistaken, repeatedly, for the absence of something being wrong. Charlotte has been trained, by instinct, by circumstance, by the peculiar education that comes with the life she leads, to perform that grace at a level most people never have to approach. She does it so well that it becomes invisible. The performance becomes the reality in the eyes of the people around her. She's fine. She's always fine. Look how composed she is, how warm, how present. But I was in that courtyard. And I know what fine looks like and what it doesn't look like. There's a specific quality to the way Tom Bowles operates that I've thought about a lot since that afternoon, and I want to try to articulate it as precisely as I can because I think the precision matters. It's not brute force. That's the thing. It's not the obvious variety of wrongness that leaves marks, that creates clear incidents, that produces the kind of evidence that a system can respond to. It's far more sophisticated than that, and I say sophisticated not as a compliment but as an observation. He has learned, whether consciously or through the long practice of personality, how to create discomfort without culpability. How to say things that land as an implication, never a statement. How to position himself, physically and socially, in ways that communicate something specific to the person he's communicating it to while remaining entirely readable as innocent to everyone else in the space. It's a skill. A particular and unpleasant kind of skill. And the thing about that skill is that it's specifically designed to function in the spaces where people like Charlotte have the least ability to respond. In public. At events. In front of cameras or guests or staff. Where any reaction, any visible discomfort, any sharp word, any pointed withdrawal would become the story. Where the person with the least power to speak is also the person most visible, most scrutinized, most at risk if they react incorrectly. He knows that. Whether explicitly or instinctively, he knows it. And he uses it. I want to say something about William now, and I want to be careful about how I say it because I'm not interested in making him a villain in this story. He isn't one. But there is something painful about the specific way he doesn't know. I've thought about it from his perspective, tried to really sit inside it. He has a relationship with his stepmother that is, by all accounts, by everything visible and audible, genuinely better than it once was. The history between Charles and Diana and the whole collapsed landscape of that era has been, over time, navigated. Not healed exactly, nothing in families ever heals the way it does in stories, but navigated. There has been a reaching toward functional coexistence, toward something that can be called a family at the necessary intervals, Christmas, formal occasions, the photographs the palace needs. Tom is part of that landscape. He exists in the arrangement. He appears at the relevant events. He shakes the relevant hands. And William, who has worked very hard to find equilibrium in a family history that was never neutral ground, probably extends to him the same good faith navigation he extends to most of his complicated family inheritance. He probably thinks it's all fine. And Charlotte, who understands the weight of that equilibrium, who knows what it costs William to maintain it, who has watched him quietly navigate a minefield for years, probably doesn't tell him. Not fully. Not in the way that would require him to respond to it, to act on it, to blow up the equilibrium. She absorbs it. And he doesn't know. And she keeps it that way, partly to protect herself and partly to protect him from having to respond to something in a way that would cost him something too. That's the thing about the women who love men in complicated situations. The protection runs in two directions simultaneously, and it's almost never acknowledged, because the woman is very good at making both directions of it invisible. I left palace work about 4 months after that afternoon. It wasn't entirely because of what I'd witnessed, there were other things, accumulated fatigue, a better opportunity elsewhere. But, that afternoon was part of it. When you see something and cannot say something and cannot do something and nothing changes that has a particular weight on a person over time. It accumulates in the joints. Makes the mornings harder. I still think about Charlotte in that courtyard. The way she stood with her back to me and her hands on the stone ledge and her shoulders moving in that controlled, private way. The way she heard me come in and turned around and made the split-second decision not to pretend. The way she accepted the cup of tea and held it with both hands and said thank you in that quiet, genuine voice that had nothing performed about it. That was the most real I ever saw her be. Just a woman in a courtyard, holding a cup of tea, catching her breath. Not the Princess of Wales. Not the carefully composed figure who had just navigated 90 minutes of a social afternoon while processing something genuinely painful. Just a person who needed 3 minutes of quiet and found them unexpectedly, and took them with whatever grace she could manage. I think about the stone ledge. The climbing hydrangea that had mostly finished by October, just brown stems and the ghost of summer color. The muffled sound of the event continuing on the other side of the wall. The gray sky above the courtyard. The way she straightened before she went back through the door. That specific act of straightening, the physical gathering of oneself, the resetting of shoulders, the lift of chin. I've done it myself. I think most women have. The moment before you re-enter the world and perform okayness with everything you have. She did it with the kind of quiet dignity that you don't learn from etiquette lessons. That's not something Kensington Palace trained into her. That comes from somewhere much older and much more personal. From years of being in rooms where you can't fall apart and deciding, over and over, to stay. I don't know what happened after that afternoon. Whether she said anything to anyone. Whether the pattern continued. Whether the equilibrium William maintains in his complicated family life was ever tested by the information that his wife has been quietly managing something painful at its edges. I hope she told someone. Not because I think it would have been easy, or uncomplicated, or without consequence. But because the alternative, the thing that happens when things stay unspoken for too long, has its own costs. Quiet ones. The kind that don't show up in photographs. I hope she had a version of that conversation with someone who could sit with all of its complexity without needing it to be simple. Without needing her to have been clearer, or louder, or less composed. I hope William, somewhere along the line, found out. Not so that there could be drama. Not so that the equilibrium could be exploded in some cathartic confrontation. Just because she deserved to be known. To have what happened to her seen by the person who loves her most. The last thing I'll say is this. There's a version of this story that makes it about the palace, about royal family politics, about the specific textures of wealth and power and the way they enable certain behaviors. And all of that is real and all of that matters. But the version I keep coming back to is smaller than that. It's a woman in a garden, holding herself together. It's the gap between what the camera sees and what the courtyard holds. It's the precise and exhausting distance between the face you show and the face that's true. That distance is not royal. That distance is not unique to palaces or dynasties or families with long histories and longer silences. That distance exists in ordinary offices and ordinary living rooms and ordinary afternoons everywhere. The garden just happened to be a famous one. The woman holding herself together just happened to be a princess. But the moment, the human moment of it, the weight of it, the particular courage of straightening before you go back through the door, that belongs to everyone. That I've seen 100 times. In 100 different places. In 100 different women who were never going to be on any front page, whose names nobody was going to write, who absorbed what they absorbed and then went back to the table and refilled the teacups and smiled and stayed. That afternoon in the garden stays with me because it put a face to something I already knew. And knowing has its own kind of weight. It stays. It always stays.